There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that you only recognize in retrospect as the precise second the world tilted on its axis. They are not loud or cataclysmic. They are quiet, folded into the stillness of a Tuesday night, hidden in the space between two breaths. For me, that moment smelled like the lavender laundry detergent I used and the faint, clean scent of chlorine that always clung to Ethan's skin, a permanent ghost of the thousands of hours he'd spent carving his path through water. It was the weight of his head on my shoulder, a casual, sleepy pressure that felt more significant than any declaration, more binding than any promise. In that silence, with the blue light of the television screen flickering across our faces, I understood that some boundaries are not lines drawn in the sand, but shorelines that are meant to be washed away by an inevitable tide. And I was standing at the water's edge, waiting. It had started 3 months before, not with a bang, but with the quiet, hollow sound of a key in a lock. Ethan had shown up at my apartment door well after midnight, his shoulders slumped in a way that seemed to defy the powerful musculature I knew so well. He was the architecture of an athlete, all sharp lines and coiled strength. But that night, he looked like a cathedral on the verge of collapse. He didn't speak at first, just stood there on my welcome mat, the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway carving shadows under his eyes. He was holding a single, crumpled cardboard box filled with a random assortment of his life. A framed photo, a worn university sweatshirt, a stack of mail, and a ridiculously oversized trophy from some collegiate championship. It was the debris of a shipwreck, the small, tangible pieces of a life he'd shared with Sarah that had just been torn apart. He started, his voice a rough and used thing. We're done. I didn't need him to say more. I had seen the storm gathering on their horizon for months. I stepped aside, holding the door open wider, a silent invitation into the quiet harbor of my life. He shuffled past me, the box held in front of him like a shield, and placed it on my small kitchen counter with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the stillness. He looked around my space, at the photographs I had pinned to the walls, the stacks of books on the floor, the comfortable chaos of my existence, as if seeing it for the first time. It was a space he had been in 100 times before, for movie nights and pre-practice coffee. But tonight his gaze was different. He was not a visitor. He was a castaway. "Can I?" he asked, his voice trailing off as he gestured vaguely toward my sofa. "Of course," I said, my own voice softer than I intended. "Stay as long as you need," and that was how it began. The first night, he slept on the couch, wrapped in the spare quilt I kept in the linen closet. I lay awake in my own bed, just one thin wall away, listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of his breathing. It was a sound that felt both intrusive and deeply comforting. For years, Ethan had been a fixed point in my universe, the sun around which my quieter planet orbited. Our friendship was a thing of simple, unspoken rules, a comfortable architecture we had built together since our freshman year on the swim team. He was the star, the one with the Olympic dreams and the relentless drive, and I was the observer, the one who saw the world through a camera lens, content to live in the quiet spaces he so often filled with his energy. I had learned long ago to build a fortress around my feelings for him, to file them away under the category of impossible things, and to appreciate the simple, uncomplicated gift of his friendship. But with him sleeping just feet away, the walls of that fortress felt terrifyingly thin. To understand the gravity of that first night, you have to understand the geography of our friendship. We met in the sterile, echoing natatorium of our university, a place that smelled perpetually of chlorine and damp towels. I was on the team more for the scholarship than for any real competitive fire, a decent distance swimmer who found a meditative rhythm in the water. Ethan, however, was born of it. He moved through the pool with a furious grace, a creature of pure power and intention. Water was his element, and on land, he sometimes seemed just as fluid, moving through social circles with an easy charm that I, with my quiet disposition and tendency to watch from the periphery, could only admire. He was bright and loud, and I was muted and still. But he'd sought me out, drawn, he once said, to the fact that I didn't seem to want anything from him. I wasn't trying to ride his coattails or bask in his reflected glory. I just saw him. Our friendship solidified over late-night study sessions fueled by terrible coffee and early morning practices where the only sounds were the rhythmic splash of our strokes and the gruff encouragement of our coach. He would talk about pressure, about the tenths of a second that separated glory from obscurity. I would listen, offering the quiet, stable presence he seemed to need. I became his anchor, the person he could be entirely himself with, stripped of the expectations that clung to him like a second skin. And in the process, my quiet admiration had deepened into something more profound, something I was careful to never let surface. It was a current running deep beneath the calm waters of our friendship, a silent, powerful force I had learned to navigate without ever acknowledging its existence. Loving Ethan from a distance had become a part of my own internal rhythm, as natural and as painful as breathing. He had dated Sarah for 3 years. She was nice enough, a bubbly, energetic art history major who seemed, on the surface, to be a perfect match for his sunlit personality. I tried to like her, for his sake, and I played my part, attending their parties and making small talk. But I always saw the subtle disconnect, the way Ethan's smile never quite reached his eyes when she was talking about their future, the way he would sometimes get a distant look, as if he were treading water in a conversation, waiting for a chance to dive deep into a silence she could never understand. I saw it because I was a student of him, of the minute shifts in his posture, the subtle inflections in his voice. I documented his life from the sidelines, both figuratively and literally. My favorite photograph, one I kept only for myself, was a candid shot I'd taken of him after a grueling practice. He was sitting on the edge of the pool, head bowed, water streaming from his hair, the late afternoon sun backlighting him in a way that made him look both heroic and profoundly lonely. That was the Ethan I knew, the one who existed in the quiet moments between the victories and the applause. That was the Ethan I loved. So when he appeared at my door, broken and adrift, a part of me, a selfish, hopeful part one was ashamed to acknowledge, felt a tremor of possibility. It was a terrible thought, to see opportunity in his pain, and I buried it immediately under a mountain of genuine concern. My primary role was to be his friend, his safe harbor, and that's what I would be, nothing more. But as the first night turned into a week, and the week into a month, the architecture of our friendship began to warp, its familiar lines bending under a new and unspoken pressure. The shift was gradual, a slow erosion of boundaries that happened so subtly I almost didn't notice it until it was complete. It began with the couch. For the first few weeks, it was his designated space. He'd come home from his punishing evening practice, eat whatever I'd cooked for dinner in near silence, and then collapse onto the cushions, pulling the quilt up to his chin. He was a ghost in my apartment, a silent, weary presence. I gave him his space, retreating to my room to edit photos, the soft clicks of my mouse a counterpoint to the drone of the television in the living room. I was acutely aware of him, of his every movement, of the sound of his breathing deepening into sleep. The apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, now felt charged with his presence, every square inch of it humming with a new energy. Then came the exhaustion. Ethan was pushing himself harder than ever in the pool, channeling all his grief and confusion into a brutal training regimen. He was chasing a spot on the national team, and he used the pain as a focal point, a way to burn out the noise in his head. But the physical toll was immense. He would come home hollowed out, sometimes too tired to even make it to the couch. One night, I found him asleep on the floor, his head pillowed on a stray sweatshirt, still in his damp practice clothes. I gently shook him awake, my hand on his shoulder feeling like a brand. He blinked up at me, his eyes unfocused and clouded with fatigue. "Come on, man," I whispered. "You can't sleep there." He let me help him up, his weight leaning heavily against me. The couch seemed a universe away. My bedroom door was open. It was an impulse, a decision made in a split second of empathy that I would spend the next week dissecting. "Just sleep here tonight," I said, guiding him toward my bed. "It's fine. I can take the couch." He was too exhausted to argue. He collapsed onto my mattress and was asleep before I could even pull the covers over him. I stood there for a long moment, watching him in the dim light filtering in from the street. His face, usually so animated, was slack with exhaustion, his dark hair fanned out against my pillow. My pillow. The thought was a jolt. I retreated to the living room, my heart hammering against my ribs, and tried to sleep on the couch, but it was useless. I was hyper-aware that he was in my bed, in my most private space, surrounded by my scent, by the very fabric of my life. It felt like a transgression, a crossing of a line I had so carefully drawn. The next morning, he was mortified. He apologized profusely, his face flushed with embarrassment, promising it wouldn't happen again. But it did. A few nights later, another wave of exhaustion hit, and again I found myself guiding his boneless form into my room. This time, I didn't offer to take the couch. I simply pulled the spare pillow from the closet and laid down on the far edge of the mattress, my back to him, maintaining a rigid, uncrossable dim Z of empty space between us. I lay there for hours, stiff as a board, listening to him breathe, every tiny shift he made in his sleep sending a shockwave through my system. It was a strange and exquisite torture. This became the new, unspoken arrangement. The couch was forgotten. My bed was now our shared space, though we never spoke of it. We were two bodies sharing a space under the pretext of his exhaustion and my convenience. It was a fiction we both tacitly agreed to maintain, a piece of plausible deniability that allowed this new, fragile intimacy to exist. The empty space between us and the bed was a testament to our unspoken rules. We did not touch. We did not acknowledge the profound oddity of our situation. We were just two friends, one of whom happened to be sleeping in the other's bed. It meant nothing, except, of course, that it meant everything. For me, lying next to him night after night was like living on a fault line. I was in a constant state of heightened awareness, cataloging every detail. The warmth that radiated from his body across the small gap between us, the way his breathing would sometimes hitch in a dream, the soft, almost imperceptible scent of him that was starting to permeate my sheets, my room, my entire life. I would lie awake, my body thrumming with a silent, desperate yearning, and I would wonder if he felt it too. I would search for signs in the daylight, for any indication that the nights meant something more to him than just a place to sleep. But in the morning, he was always just Ethan, my friend. He'd clap me on the shoulder, thank me for the coffee, and head out the door to go battle the water, leaving me alone in the wreckage of my own hope. The ritual was what truly undid me. It evolved from the sleeping arrangement, an offshoot of the new domesticity that had settled over us. It started with movie nights. We'd always done them, but now they were different. We'd crowd onto my small sofa, a bowl of popcorn between us, and lose ourselves in some mindless action film. But as the movie wore on and his exhaustion set in, he would start to drift. His head would nod, and then, inevitably, it would come to rest on my shoulder. The first time it happened, I froze. My entire body went rigid, every muscle tensed. I was certain he would wake up, realize what he'd done, and pull away in a panic. But he didn't. He just sighed, a soft, contented sound, and settled in deeper, his arm pressing against mine. I sat there for the entire 2-hour runtime of the movie, my shoulder aching, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, terrified to move a muscle for fear of breaking the spell. His hair was soft against my cheek, and I could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his pulse through the fabric of his t-shirt. It was the most profound physical contact I had ever had with him, and it was happening under the guise of sleep. It was safe. It was deniable, and it was agonizing. This became our routine. Every movie night, every time we sat on the couch for more than 20 minutes, he would fall asleep on me. It became so regular that I began to anticipate it, to brace myself for the moment his weight would settle against me. The initial shock gave way to a quiet, painful acceptance. This was all I would ever get, these stolen moments of unconscious intimacy. I became an expert at feigning nonchalance, at continuing to watch the movie as if the man I was hopelessly in love with wasn't asleep on my shoulder, his hand sometimes draped loosely over my thigh. I learned to control my breathing, to quiet the frantic beating of my heart, to exist in that space of unbearable closeness without giving myself away. The space between us and the bed began to shrink. It wasn't a conscious decision, just a natural drift in the night. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find that the demilitarized zone had vanished. Sometimes my hand would be brushing against his back. Sometimes his leg would be thrown over mine. One morning, I woke up to find his arm draped across my chest, his face buried in the crook of my neck, his breath warm against my skin. I lay there, trapped and breathless, until the sun began to stream through the blinds. I didn't dare move. I just absorbed the reality of it, the solid, warm weight of him, the feeling of being held, however unconsciously. When his alarm finally went off, he jolted awake and pulled back instantly, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before he mumbled an apology and bolted for the shower. He never mentioned it. We never spoke of the way we were found in the mornings, tangled together like driftwood. We just let the silence hold the truth, whatever that truth was. I was living a double life. In the daylight, I was Liam, the steady, reliable friend. At night, I was the keeper of secrets, the silent observer of 1,000 small intimacies that might mean everything or nothing at all. My photography became my only outlet. I couldn't photograph him. It felt too vulnerable, too much like a confession, so I photographed the evidence of him instead. The indentation his head left on my pillow. The single coffee mug he used every morning, left to dry by the sink. The way his damp towel was always slung over the back of a kitchen chair. My apartment had become a museum of his presence, and I was its lonely curator. I was drowning, and the worst part was that he was the water. He was the one who offered this lifeline of ambiguous affection, and he was also the one pulling me under. I oscillated between a state of delirious, hopeful joy and a deep, aching despair. Was I just a convenient comfort object, a human pillow he used to weather the storm of his breakup? Or was there something more, something he was too afraid or too confused to articulate? I would watch him across the dinner table, watch the way he'd laugh at something I said, the easy, unforced way he existed in my space, and a dangerous hope would bloom in my chest. But then he would mention a girl from his team who had asked him out, or talk about getting back on the dating scene eventually, and that hope would wither and die, leaving me chilled and empty. The tension was building, a static charge in the air of my small apartment. It felt unsustainable. Something had to break. I knew it, but I was terrified of being the one to force the issue. To ask the question, "What are we doing?" felt like pulling the pin from a grenade. The potential fallout was too catastrophic to contemplate. Losing his friendship would be a kind of death. So I remained silent, a willing participant in our shared fiction, and I waited. I waited for a sign, for a clue, for something definitive that would tell me which way to go. I was so focused on looking for the sign that I almost missed it when it finally arrived, not as a flash of lightning, but as a quiet shift in the dark. It was a Thursday, a particularly brutal one, from the sounds of it. Ethan had been at a time trial for the national team qualifiers, a high-pressure event that had been looming for months. He came home late, well after I'd finished dinner, and the usual post-practice exhaustion was replaced by a taut, brittle energy. He didn't slump onto the couch. He paced the small confines of my living room like a caged animal, running a hand through his damp hair over and over again. He hadn't made the cut. He'd missed it by 4/100ths of a second. An eternity in his world. A lifetime. 4/100ths, he said, the words sharp and bitter. He kicked at the leg of my coffee table, not hard, but with a frustrated despair that was more painful to watch than any overt display of anger. All that work. For nothing. It's not nothing, Ethan, I said softly, my voice feeling inadequate against the sheer wall of his disappointment. He just shook his head, the fight seeming to drain out of him all at once. He finally collapsed onto the couch, but not into his usual sleepy posture. He sat upright, his elbows on his knees, and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. It was the first time I had ever seen him cry. Not just tear up, but truly, deeply cry. The sound was a raw, tearing thing that seemed to rip through the quiet fabric of our carefully constructed world. My heart broke for him, for his shattered dream, for the immense pressure he carried so relentlessly. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to go to him, to put my arms around him, to offer the physical comfort he so often took from me unconsciously. But to do it now, when he was awake and aware, felt like crossing a new and far more dangerous line. The plausible deniability of sleep was gone. This would be a conscious act, an explicit offer of comfort that could be misinterpreted, or worse, interpreted correctly. But watching him break apart in front of me was unbearable. I couldn't just sit there. I moved from my armchair and sat down on the couch beside him, leaving a careful few inches of space between us. I didn't touch him. I just sat there, a silent, supportive presence, letting him know he wasn't alone in his despair. He cried for a long time, the sounds eventually subsiding into ragged, hitching breaths. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken things. He finally lifted his head from his hands, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. He looked at me, really looked at me, with an expression of such raw vulnerability that it stole the air from my lungs. "I don't know what I would do without you, Liam," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You don't have to," I replied, my own voice barely a breath. He leaned forward then, not in a way that suggested sleep, but with a clear, deliberate intention. He closed the small gap between us and rested his forehead against mine. His skin was cool and damp. I could feel his breath ghosting across my lips. My entire world narrowed to that single point of contact, the gentle pressure of his forehead against mine. We stayed like that for a long, timeless moment, just breathing each other's air in the dim light of the living room. It was more intimate than any of the nights we had spent tangled in my bed, more profound than any time he had slept on my shoulder. This was real. This was happening. And then he spoke again, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. It wasn't a statement, but a question, a plea for permission that hung in the air between us, shimmering with terror and hope. Would it be okay? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I knew what he was asking. The question was a key, turning the lock on a door I had long since bolted shut. In that moment, all the fear, all the anxiety, all the careful calculations I had been making for months, for years, simply dissolved. There was no other possible answer. There never had been. I didn't speak. I just closed my eyes and tilted my head slightly, the smallest of movements, an answer given in a language beyond words. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss like the ones in movies. It was tentative, soft, and heartbreakingly gentle. It was a question, a discovery, a confession. His lips were hesitant against mine, exploring a new and terrifying territory. I met his hesitation with a quiet certainty, a gentleness of my own, trying to pour all the years of unspoken affection, all the patient waiting, into that one, simple touch. It was a kiss that tasted of salt, from his tears or the ghost of the pool, I couldn't tell. It was slow and careful, and it felt like coming home. When he finally pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine again, his eyes still closed. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence was no longer heavy with unspoken things. It was light, filled with a fragile, shimmering truth. He had crossed the line, and I had met him there. We were on new ground now, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The morning after was a study in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the ones we had shared before. It was brittle, fragile, laced with a new and palpable anxiety. I woke up first, to the gray light of dawn filtering through my blinds. Ethan was on his side of the bed, a rigid line of distance between us, his back to me. He was so still I couldn't tell if he was awake. The memory of the kiss, of the profound, earth-shattering tenderness of it, was so vivid it felt like a dream. But the solid, warm presence of him in my bed was proof that it had been real. I lay there, my heart a mix of soaring hope and creeping dread, waiting for him to stir. When he finally did, he moved with a sudden, jerky motion, as if waking from a nightmare. He sat up, running a hand through his already messy hair, and for a long moment, he just stared at the wall opposite the bed. He didn't look at me. He didn't speak. The silence stretched, thin and tight, threatening to snap. I could feel him retreating, pulling away from me, from what had happened between us, building a wall brick by silent brick. "Ethan," I finally ventured, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders. "I gotta get to practice," he mumbled, swinging his legs out of bed and standing up. He moved around the room with a frantic, avoidant energy, grabbing his gym bag, pulling on a sweatshirt, his movements stiff and unnatural. He was a stranger in my room, a space that had become as much his as it was mine. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was looking everywhere but at me, at the floor, at the door, at his own hands fumbling with the zipper of his bag. "Ethan, wait," I said, sitting up. "We should talk about last night." "There's nothing to talk about," he said quickly, his back still to me. "I was a mess. I was upset. It was a mistake. I'm sorry." Each word was a physical blow. A mistake. The word echoed in the space between us, cold and sharp. All the warmth, all the vulnerability from the night before had vanished, replaced by this panicked, sterile denial. He was erasing it, trying to scrub it clean from the record of our friendship. He finally turned to face me, but his gaze was fixed somewhere over my shoulder. His face was a mask of strained neutrality, but I could see the panic flickering in his eyes. I'll crash at Mark's place for a while," he said, referring to another guy from the team. "Give you your space back," and with that, he was gone. The door to my bedroom clicked shut, followed a moment later by the heavier sound of the front door closing. And then, there was only silence. A profound, deafening silence that was heavier and more painful than any I had ever known. The apartment felt cavernous, empty. The indentation on the pillow next to me was a cruel reminder of what I had held for a fleeting moment, and what I had now, apparently, lost. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in my chest just hours before had been violently extinguished, leaving behind nothing but the cold, bitter ash of regret. I had misinterpreted everything. I had allowed myself to believe in a fiction, and the reality was this. I was just a port in a storm, and the storm had passed. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. Ethan was true to his word. He stayed with Mark. He didn't answer my texts. He avoided me at the pool, timing his arrivals and departures so we would never have to cross paths. When we did, by unavoidable chance, find ourselves in the same locker room, he would offer a curt nod, his eyes fixed on the floor, and quickly move away. He had cut me out of his life with a surgical precision that was both impressive and devastating. The easy, comfortable rhythm of our friendship was gone, replaced by this awkward, painful dance of avoidance. I was a wreck. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. The emptiness of my apartment was a constant, physical ache. Every corner held a ghost of him. The couch where he'd slept on my shoulder, the kitchen where we'd made late-night omelets, the bed that still held the faint, fading scent of him. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, searching for a clue I had missed. Had I been wrong to lean into it? Had I imagined the tenderness, the vulnerability in his eyes? His words, "It was a mistake," were a mantra of self-recrimination. I had ruined the most important relationship in my life by daring to hope for more. The fortress I had built around my heart for years had been breached, not by him, but by my own foolish optimism. I tried to focus on my photography, but even that offered no solace. I looked through my lens, and all I saw was absence. I developed photos in the darkroom, the chemical smells that usually comforted me now only making me feel nauseous. The images that emerged felt flat, lifeless. I had lost my subject, not the man himself, but the feeling he inspired in me, the quiet, constant hum of his presence that had become the background music to my life. Without it, the world seemed muted, out of focus. After a week of this agonizing silence, something inside me shifted. The grief began to curdle into anger, an anger born of frustration and a deep, profound sense of hurt. A mistake? Maybe it was. But it was a mistake we had made together. He didn't get to detonate our world and then walk away, leaving me to sift through the rubble alone. He owed me more than that. Our friendship, the years of trust and intimacy we had built, deserved more than a mumbled apology and a hasty retreat. I deserved an explanation. I deserved the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I found him after his evening practice. I knew his routine, knew he often stayed late, swimming extra laps to clear his head. I waited for him by his car in the near-empty parking lot, the air cool and damp. The sodium lights cast long, distorted shadows on the pavement. When he finally came out of the building, his gym bag slung over his shoulder, he stopped short when he saw me. He looked trapped, a deer caught in the headlights. For a moment, I thought he might turn around and walk away. "We need to talk, Ethan," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And you don't get to run away this time," he sighed, a sound of pure, weary resignation. He dropped his bag by his feet and leaned against the side of his car, crossing his arms over his chest. It was a defensive posture, a wall he was putting up between us. "There's nothing to say, Liam. Bullshit." I shot back, the anger finally breaking through my carefully controlled exterior. "There's everything to say. You can't just kiss me like that, like you meant it, and then pretend it never happened. You don't get to do that to me." "To us," he winced at my words, his gaze finally lifting to meet mine. In the harsh orange light of the parking lot, I could see the conflict warring in his eyes. It wasn't indifference I saw there, it was fear. Pure, unadulterated terror. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his voice cracking. "That I'm not completely freaked out? That I know what the hell I'm doing? Because I don't. I've never. I don't feel this way. About guys, but you feel this way about me," I said, the words a statement, not a question. I needed to hear him say it. I needed to know I wasn't crazy. He looked away, his jaw tight. He stared out across the empty parking lot, at the dark, imposing silhouette of the stadium. The silence stretched on, filled only by the distant hum of traffic. I thought he wasn't going to answer, that he was going to retreat back into his denial. But then, he spoke, his voice so low it was almost carried away by the night air. "I don't know what I feel," he admitted, the words sounding like they were being torn from him. "It's confusing. All I know is that for the past few months, the only time I've felt, okay, the only time the noise in my head stops, is when I'm with you. And that night, when I kissed you, it was the first time I felt anything other than numb or angry in months. It felt," he trailed off, searching for the word. "It felt right. And that scares the hell out of me." The confession hung in the air between us, raw and honest. All my anger dissipated, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost knocked me off my feet. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was a man whose entire life had been built on a foundation of clear lines, of black and white, of victory and defeat. He was a swimmer who followed the black line at the bottom of the pool, always moving forward, always on a set course. And I was an uncharted current, pulling him in a direction he had never anticipated, a direction for which he had no map. "Why are you scared?" I asked gently. He finally looked at me again, his eyes filled with a desperate, heartbreaking plea for understanding. "Because this isn't my life, Liam. This isn't who I am. I'm the guy who dates girls like Sarah. I'm the swimmer who's supposed to go to the Olympics and get a sponsorship deal and live in the suburbs. It doesn't fit. It messes everything up. So you'd rather be miserable and fit into the life you think you're supposed to have than be happy with something unexpected?" I asked, the question soft but pointed. His face crumpled, the carefully constructed mask of the stoic athlete falling away to reveal the confused, terrified young man underneath. "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't know how." I closed the distance between us, stopping just in front of him. I didn't reach for him, didn't try to touch him. I just stood there, letting him see that I wasn't going to push, that I wasn't going to run. "You don't have to know everything right now, Ethan," I said. "You just have to stop running. From me. From this. We can figure it out. Together. Or we can just go back to being friends. But you have to talk to me. You can't just shut me out. That's the only thing I can't handle." He stared at me for a long, silent moment, his eyes searching mine. I let him look, let him see the truth of my words, the unwavering steadiness of my feelings for him. I wasn't an anomaly that was messing up his life. I was a constant, the one person who had seen him at his worst and hadn't flinched. The fear in his eyes slowly began to recede, replaced by a flicker of something else. something that looked a lot like relief. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Liam, for how I acted. I was a coward, you were scared." I corrected him gently. "There's a difference." He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of surrender. The tension that had been holding his body rigid for a week seemed to drain away, leaving him slumped against the car, looking younger and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. "Can I?" he started, his voice hesitant. "Can I come home?" The question was simple, but it held the weight of 100 others. He wasn't just asking to come back to my apartment. He was asking to come back to me, to the safety and comfort of our shared space, to whatever it was we were building together. I gave him a small, tired smile. "Yeah, Ethan, you can come home." The drive back to my apartment was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence now, the kind we used to have. The brittle anxiety was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. When we walked through the door, it felt different. It felt like a conscious choice, a new beginning. He dropped his bag by the door and just stood in the middle of the living room, looking around as if he were reacquainting himself with a place he had been away from for years. That night, when we got into bed, the dynamic had shifted entirely. There was no pretense of exhaustion, no fiction of convenience. It was an intentional act. He turned to face me in the dark, the space between us charged not with anxiety, but with a quiet, deliberate anticipation. He reached out, his hand hesitant at first, and gently cupped my cheek. His thumb stroked my skin, a soft, questioning touch. "I'm still scared," he whispered into the darkness. "Me too," I whispered back, my hand coming up to cover his. He leaned in and kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of profound relief, of homecoming. It was slow and deep and sure, a confirmation of everything that had been left unsaid. It wasn't a mistake. It was a beginning. We didn't need to have all the answers. We didn't need a map for where we were going. All we needed was to be brave enough to stop running and to hold on to each other in the dark. The days and weeks that followed our confrontation in the parking lot were like learning a new language. We were building something new from the foundation of our old friendship, and it required a different vocabulary, a new set of rhythms. The ambiguity that had been both a source of comfort and torment was gone, and in its place was a deliberate, sometimes clumsy, intentionality. We talked, really talked, for the first time. We laid our fears out on the table like cards, examining them in the quiet, safe light of my apartment. Ethan spoke of the pressure he felt from his family, from his sport, from a world that had always presented him with a very narrow, very straight path to follow. He confessed that his relationship with Sarah had felt hollow for a long time, a performance he was giving because it was what was expected of him. He admitted that the comfort he found with me was so deep and so easy that it had unnerved him long before he could put a name to the feelings that accompanied it. I, in turn, confessed the years of my own quiet yearning, the careful way I had compartmentalized my love for him to protect our friendship and to protect myself. I told him about the photograph I kept, the one of him on the edge of the pool, and why it was my favorite. I explained that I had fallen in love not with the celebrated athlete, but with the quiet, lonely man who existed in the moments between the races. Listening to me, his expression was one of dawning wonder, as if he were seeing himself, and us, through a new lens for the first time. It was a period of intense, terrifying, and beautiful vulnerability. We were dismantling the old architecture of our relationship and, piece by piece, building a new one founded on honesty instead of unspoken rules. The physical aspect of our relationship evolved with that same gentle, deliberate pace. The nightly ritual of him falling asleep on my shoulder during a movie didn't stop, but now it was different. It wasn't an unconscious act of seeking comfort anymore. It was a choice. He would lean his head against me with a soft sigh, and I would wrap my arm around him, pulling him closer. There was no pretense, no plausible deniability. It was just us, finding our way back to a familiar comfort, but now with the freedom to acknowledge what it truly was. Sleeping was no longer an exercise in torturous proximity. We would curl up together in the dark, my arms around him, his back pressed against my chest, his hand often finding mine and lacing our fingers together. I learned the topography of his body, the way his muscles tensed even in sleep, the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against my hand. These were the quiet, domestic intimacies that felt more profound than any grand romantic gesture. It was the simple, solid fact of his presence, freely and intentionally given. There were still moments of fear, flashes of the old panic in his eyes. One afternoon, we were walking across campus, and he saw some of his teammates approaching. I felt him tense, saw him instinctively start to pull away from me. Our hands had been casually brushing against each other. It was a small, almost imperceptible reaction, but it felt like a cold splash of water. The world outside the sanctuary of my apartment was still a scary, unnavigated place for him. I didn't say anything, just let him create the distance he needed. But later that night, he brought it up himself. "I'm sorry about today," he said, his voice quiet. "With the guys. I panicked." "It's okay, Ethan," I reassured him, my hand finding his in the dark. "We can go at your pace. There are no rules here. No expectations, but I don't want to be that person," he said, his voice tight with self-frustration. "The one who's ashamed. Because I'm not ashamed of this. Of you. I'm just new at this. And I'm scared of losing things. You won't lose me," I said, my voice firm with a certainty that seemed to soothe him. "That's the one thing you don't have to be scared of." Slowly, tentatively, he began to let the reality of us seep into the other corners of his life. It started small. He told Mark, his closest friend on the team, the one he had stayed with during our week of silence. To his immense relief, Mark had just shrugged and said, "Dude, I kind of figured. As long as you're happy." That small act of acceptance was like a dam breaking for Ethan. It made the possibility of a world where all the pieces of his life could coexist seem real. He was still the driven athlete, the focused competitor, but he was also someone who was in love with his best friend. He was learning that these truths didn't have to be mutually exclusive. He was learning that he could define his own life, that it didn't have to fit into a pre-approved mold. Our home, my apartment that had become ours, was the crucible where this new reality was forged. It was in the quiet moments that our relationship truly took root and blossomed. It was in me bringing him a coffee in the morning without him having to ask. It was in him starting to leave his things around the apartment not as a temporary guest, but as a resident, his toothbrush in the holder next to mine, a stack of his books on the nightstand, his ridiculously large collection of team hoodies taking over my closet. He started cooking, filling the apartment with the smell of slightly burnt garlic bread and the sound of his off-key humming. We were building a life, a small, quiet world that was just for us. One evening, months later, I was in my makeshift darkroom, a converted closet, developing some new prints. The red safe light cast a warm, intimate glow over everything. Ethan came in and stood behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood in silence for a few minutes, watching as an image slowly began to emerge in the chemical bath. It was a landscape I had shot a few weeks before, a picture of the coastline at dawn, the water calm and the sky soft with nascent light. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "I like the quiet ones," I said, gesturing to the print with my tongs. "The moments just before the world wakes up." "I get that," he said, his arms tightening around me. "It's like here, in this apartment. It feels like the quiet moment before the world wakes up." He was right. Our life together had that same quality of sacred stillness, a safe harbor from the noise and the pressure of the outside world. He had come to my door as a shipwreck, and somewhere along the way, we had built a new vessel together, one strong enough to carry us both. We had navigated the treacherous currents of fear and confusion, and had found our way to a calm, quiet sea. Some things, I've learned, are not discovered, but are slowly, painstakingly built. Love, for us, wasn't a lightning strike or a sudden revelation. It was a slow and steady construction, built of 1,000 small, quiet moments. It was built of late-night conversations and shared silences, of sleepy mornings and movie nights on the couch. It was built of fear and courage, of retreat and return. We didn't fall in love. We grew it, nurtured it, protected it. We learned that a home isn't just a place with four walls and a roof. It's a feeling of safety, of being seen and accepted for exactly who you are, without pretense or performance. It's the profound, unshakable peace of knowing that no matter how rough the waters get, there is an anchor, a steady hand to hold, a quiet harbor waiting for you. And as we stood there in the warm, red darkness, watching a new world come into focus, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that we had finally, truly, come home. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together.